In 2024, China bought over $12 billion worth of American soybeans. In 2025, that number fell to $3 billion. China did not stop eating. It did not stop needing soybeans. It simply stopped buying them from the United States and bought them from Brazil instead. That is not a trade statistic. That is a structural shift in one of the most important commercial relationships in global agriculture, and it happened in a single year. And soybeans are just the clearest example of a pattern that is now running across nearly every major American agricultural export: beef, pork, corn, wheat, and into every major market that the U.S. has spent decades building. The world is not boycotting American food. It is redirecting. It is finding alternative suppliers, signing long-term contracts with countries that are not threatening tariff wars, and in many cases building supply relationships that are explicitly designed to reduce dependence on the United States. The process is quiet, unglamorous, and largely invisible to domestic political coverage. But it is happening at a speed and scale that should alarm anyone who understands what agricultural export dominance actually means for American economic power. To understand what is being lost, you first need to understand what American agricultural dominance actually built. The United States has been one of the top 2 or 3 agricultural exporters in the world for decades. In 2022, total U.S. agricultural exports hit a record $194 billion. The country is the world's largest exporter of soybeans by value, a top 3 beef and pork exporter, and a major supplier of corn, wheat, and cotton to markets across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Europe. That export revenue does not just flow to farmers. It flows through rural economies, through shipping and logistics networks, through the banks that finance planting seasons and equipment purchases, and through the small towns that exist because agriculture exists around them. Agricultural export dominance also confers geopolitical leverage that rarely gets discussed in those terms but is very real. Countries that depend on American food supply are more likely to maintain constructive relationships with Washington. The reverse is equally true. Countries that have successfully diversified their food supply sources are freer to pursue foreign policies that diverge from American preferences. When China reduces its dependence on American soybeans, it is not just changing a trade flow, it is reducing a structural vulnerability that gave the U.S. leverage. The mechanism behind the current shift is tariffs, specifically the retaliatory tariffs that China imposed in 2025 in response to escalating U.S. trade actions. Beijing raised tariffs on U.S. agricultural goods as part of a broader trade war that saw duties on Chinese imports climb as high as 135% before partial rollbacks. China's retaliation hit American agriculture with precision. Soybeans, beef, pork, and a range of other commodities that had been central to the U.S.-China agricultural relationship for years. The numbers are stark. U.S. agricultural exports to China dropped by nearly $15 billion on an annualized basis between March 2025 and February 2026, according to the North Dakota State University Agricultural Trade Monitor. Almost $5 billion more in lost trade than American farmers saw during the first Trump administration. In 2024, more than $12 billion worth of American soybeans went to China. In 2025, that figure declined by 3/4 to just $3 billion. Beef tells an even more dramatic story. In March 2025, China allowed the export licenses of hundreds of U.S. beef facilities to expire, effectively blocking them from selling to China. Monthly U.S. beef exports to China fell by more than 90%. In 2024, the U.S. held about 9% of China's beef import market. By the third quarter of 2025, that share had dropped to less than 1%, while Brazil and Australia accounted for 59% and 13% respectively. Before we go further, if this kind of analysis on global trade, food systems, and what agricultural policy actually costs the American economy is what you come here for, subscribe now. We cover this every week. Here is the part of the story that makes the current losses more than a temporary tariff dispute, and it comes down to a word that should make every American agricultural exporter nervous: substitution. When a buyer redirects to an alternative supplier because of a tariff, one of two things happens. Either the tariff goes away and they come back, or the relationship with the new supplier matures, deepens, and eventually becomes preferable. The first scenario is the recoverable one. The second is the structural problem. Brazil is deep into the second scenario. Brazil beef exports reached a record $18.03 billion in 2025, up 40% year-on-year as the country overtook the United States to become the world's largest beef producer for the first time since the 1960s. Brazilian soybean exports to China are expected to reach an unprecedented 112 million metric tons in 2026. Brazil's planted soybean area has been expanding every year for nearly 2 decades. Its port infrastructure is being upgraded to handle the increased volume. And the Chinese buyers who switched from American soybeans to Brazilian ones in 2025 did not do so on a spot contract basis. They signed long-term supply agreements. China signed a deal with Argentina to supply soybeans, corn, and vegetable oil. Australia's agricultural exports to China surged as American beef disappeared from Chinese shelves. The countries that stepped into the gaps left by American retaliatory response trade policy are not going to vacate those positions willingly when a trade agreement eventually emerges from Washington. A May 2026 framework agreement between the U.S. and China included commitments for China to purchase at least $17 billion of American agricultural products annually through 2028 and at least 25 million metric tons of soybeans per year. On paper, that sounds like a recovery, but analysts tracking the actual implementation are cautious. Chinese government commitments in trade frameworks have historically been conditional on the broader trade relationship remaining stable, and that relationship has repeatedly demonstrated it can destabilize quickly. More importantly, the structural shifts that occurred during 2025 do not reverse automatically even if the purchases resume. Brazil's farmers planted for the Chinese market. Their infrastructure investments are in place, their relationships are established. Even if Chinese buyers return to American soybeans in volume, they will now be doing so alongside Brazilian soybeans, not instead of them. The American share of the Chinese soybean import market is permanently smaller than it was in 2023, even under an optimistic scenario. In 2025, China fell from the top 5 U.S. agricultural export destinations as exports to China shrank to $8.4 billion, down from over $25 billion just 3 years earlier. The deeper problem runs beyond any single trade dispute, and it is one that the current policy debate almost entirely ignores. Agricultural export relationships take years to build and can be disrupted in months. The trust that underlies long-term supply contracts, the confidence that your supplier will be there, that shipments will move, that prices will be predictable, is not recreated quickly once it is broken. American farmers and exporters are now competing not just on price and quality, which they have always done, but on reliability. And reliability is exactly the attribute that repeated cycles of tariff escalation and trade war uncertainty have called into question. That shift in perception matters as much as the actual disruptions. A grain buyer in Shanghai or a meat importer in Jakarta does not need to have personally experienced a canceled shipment to start building alternative supply relationships. They just need to watch what happened to buyers who did, and then make a rational decision about concentration risk in their own supply chain. The United States used to be the reliable option, the supplier you could count on regardless of what else was happening in global politics. That reputation was built over decades. It is being spent down quickly, and reputations of that kind are far easier to lose than to rebuild. No one can replace all the volume that China buys, one farm operator told the Agricultural Trade Council, describing canceled orders and port congestion in the spring of 2025. That sentence captures the structural reality better than any policy analysis can. China is the world's largest agricultural importer. It buys at a scale that no combination of alternative markets fully replaces. When that buyer diversifies its supply base, the countries that lose market share do not get it all back by signing a framework agreement in Beijing. Here is the bottom line. U.S. agricultural exports are projected at $169 billion in 2026, the lowest over the last 5 years. Meanwhile, the trade deficit in agriculture, the gap between what the U.S. exports and what it imports, hit $28.6 billion in the first half of 2025 alone. A country that once ran consistent agricultural trade surpluses is now running a structural deficit in the one sector where it had perhaps its most durable global advantage. The world is not turning away from American agriculture because American farmers are producing inferior food. It is turning away because the policy environment around that food has become unpredictable, adversarial, and expensive to depend on. In the economics of supply chains, unpredictability is a cost, and buyers who can source equivalent quality elsewhere, reliably, contractually, and without geopolitical risk attached, will do exactly that. The market share being lost right now took decades to build. It will not be rebuilt in a single trade agreement cycle, and every month it stays lost, the alternative suppliers grow stronger, their infrastructure deepens, and the American agricultural position in global markets becomes a little harder to recover. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you are thinking about trade policy, American agriculture, and what global food supply chains actually look like right now, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.